The courthouse stood tall against the morning sky, a brick building that had seen decades of trials, victories, and heartbreak. Inside, the air was heavy with tension, as though every sound echoed louder than usual. It wasn't just another day. This was no ordinary case. The people seated inside knew it, and so did the judge presiding over the trial. A high-profile matter had drawn crowds, journalists, and even local families, curious enough to witness justice unfolding. The courtroom was a striking contrast of old-world solemnity and modern urgency. The polished oak benches, the flags draped behind the judge's seat, and the solemn oath etched on the wall, all reminded everyone that this was a place where words held power, where silence often spoke louder than noise. The bailiff, standing tall by the door, scanned the room with an expressionless face, as if daring anyone to break the decorum. At the front, the judge adjusted his glasses and shuffled his papers, trying to maintain the rhythm of the day, despite knowing that everyone was waiting for a pivotal moment. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his notepad, while the prosecutor whispered something urgently to an assistant. Jurors sat in 2 neat rows, eyes forward, their expressions difficult to read. Some appeared focused, others restless, as though the weight of their responsibility pressed on them like an invisible chain. The audience benches were filled with faces neighbors, journalists scribbling notes, and even community leaders curious about the outcome. Many had followed the case in the news for weeks, watching every development, waiting to see how this chapter would end. Mothers had come with children, fathers had taken time off work, and reporters held cameras discreetly outside, capturing reactions of those entering and leaving the courthouse. And yet, amid this sea of serious faces, one stood out, a little girl, just 3 years old, perched beside her mother on one of the back benches. Her feet dangled off the edge, swinging slightly as she held on to the smooth wooden seat with her tiny hands. She had no understanding of the solemnity that gripped the room. The gavel, the legal jargon, the stern voices, they meant nothing to her. For her, the courtroom was simply another unfamiliar room filled with strangers. Her mother had whispered instructions before they entered. "Be quiet, sweetheart. Don't talk too much. Just sit with Mommy." The girl had nodded, though the meaning of those words had only partly sunk in. She clutched a small stuffed animal, hidden partially beneath her coat, and studied the people around her. She noticed the shiny badges on the officers' chests, the robes of the judge, and the serious whispers between the lawyers. To her, it all seemed like a performance, like the scenes she sometimes saw on television when her mother switched the channel to the news. The trial itself was one that had stirred the entire town. A crime had been committed, one that involved betrayal, broken trust, and unanswered questions. Though the little girl could not possibly grasp it, the stakes were high. A conviction would mean closure for some, but also the unraveling of reputations and the exposure of secrets long buried. That was why the seats were filled, why people leaned forward with every word spoken, and why silence was guarded so fiercely. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the stillness, and reminded everyone of the gravity of the proceedings. His deep voice echoed through the chamber, commanding respect, yet there was something almost weary in his tone. He, too, felt the tension. He, too, knew this case would be remembered. Reporters' pens scratched against their notepads, catching every phrase, every shift in body language, every stumble of a witness. The prosecutor straightened his tie, preparing for the next phase of questioning, while the defense attorney organized his papers with deliberate precision. It was a dance of strategy, one where every step mattered, every glance could be misinterpreted. But as serious as the trial was, the little girl's world was different. She looked around with wide eyes, fascinated by the way people kept so quiet, by the way they listened so intently. She noticed the wooden mallet on the judge's desk and wondered why no one was playing with it. She noticed the tall officer standing by the door and thought he looked like the characters in the cartoons. Her older brother watched. Most of all, she noticed the silence. A silence so deep that the smallest sound, even her shifting feet, seemed to echo louder than it should. Her mother placed a gentle hand on her knee, a reminder to stay still. The little girl nodded, but her curiosity was stronger than her patience. She glanced back toward the door, wondering if anyone else might come in. The trial, to her, felt endless. To the adults, it was gripping. To the child, it was simply strange. As the lawyers prepared their arguments, and the judge leaned forward with a questioning gaze, the stage was being set for something extraordinary. No one in that room, not the seasoned prosecutor, not the meticulous defense attorney, not the weary judge, could have predicted what would happen next. For now, the courtroom was caught in a delicate balance: silence, tension, and anticipation. Every breath, every movement seemed amplified by the weight of justice. The people seated there thought they knew the story they were about to hear. They thought they understood the evidence, the witnesses, the truth waiting to be revealed. But hidden among them was a voice no one expected. A voice not shaped by strategy, law, or experience, but by innocence. A voice that would, with just two simple words, shift the course of everything. And so the courtroom waited, unaware that a toddler's quiet presence on the back bench would soon become the center of attention, altering not only the trial, but the way everyone in that room would remember that day. The little girl shifted slightly on the bench, her small legs dangling and swinging in rhythm against the polished wood. She was 3 years old in age when the world was still a wonderland, when every sound, every face, every place carried a magic adults had long forgotten. For her, the courtroom was not a place of judgment or law. It was simply another room, large and echoing, filled with people who seemed far too serious for her liking. She clutched a small stuffed animal tightly in her hand. It was a faded bunny, its ears worn from being pulled and hugged too many times. To anyone else, it was an old toy. To her, it was comfort, the anchor that kept her safe in unfamiliar spaces. She held it against her chest as her wide eyes roamed the room. The adults around her had their minds weighed down with matters of justice. They were lost in evidence, testimony, and outcomes. But the little girl lived in another world, one where curiosity was stronger than caution. She studied the people in front of her, the stern judge in his black robe, the lawyers who seemed to be in a contest of who could talk louder and faster, and the jurors who looked like they had forgotten how to smile. She tilted her head, wondering why everyone was so serious. Her mother, seated beside her, gently placed a hand on her knee. "Be still," she whispered softly, though her eyes never left the front of the courtroom. The girl nodded, but as children often do, she quickly drifted back into her own thoughts. She traced patterns with her finger along the smooth bench, pretending for a moment that it was a racetrack for her toy bunny. She leaned forward to catch a better view of the judge's gavel, thinking it looked like a wooden toy hammer. She smiled, amused by the idea that someone might use it to build blocks instead of command silence. The people around her hardly noticed. They were too wrapped up in the unfolding trial. Witnesses were being called, papers shuffled, objections raised and sustained. Each voice carried weight, each moment was measured. But in the midst of this storm of legal arguments, the little girl hummed a quiet tune under her breath, a melody known only to her. For her, silence wasn't heavy, it was boring. Adults sat stiffly, speaking in tones that carried no warmth. She wondered why no one laughed, why no one clapped, why no one told a story. To her innocent eyes, this gathering wasn't about law, it was about people forgetting how to live. Her gaze drifted to the jury box again. One juror had gray hair and glasses that kept slipping down his nose. She giggled softly when he pushed them back up again, like it was part of a game. Another juror tapped his finger absent-mindedly against the wood, and she mimicked the rhythm with her tiny shoes. Her mother hushed her again, but there was no malice in her voice, only worry. She knew a courtroom was no place for a child, yet circumstances had left her with no choice but to bring her daughter along that day. She prayed her little one would stay quiet, unnoticed, invisible in the sea of solemn faces. But innocence has a way of breaking through walls adults carefully build. The girl's laughter, though small, was like a pebble tossed into still water. It rippled outward. A few jurors stole glances at her, their stern expressions softening, if only for a second. Even the judge, caught between testimonies, looked briefly toward the back where she sat. He quickly returned his attention to the matter at hand, but something in his eyes had shifted, as though reminded of the humanity often lost in the ritual of justice. The child's mind wandered further. She imagined the courtroom as a castle, the judge as a king, and the lawyers as knights locked in battle. She pictured herself sneaking into the story as a princess with her bunny for a sidekick. She giggled at the thought, covering her mouth with her hand. To her, it was all a game. Innocence is blind to the weight of consequence. She did not know that her voice, so small and unpracticed, had the power to shake a courtroom. She did not know that her presence, dismissed by adults as unimportant, was in fact destiny waiting to unfold. She fidgeted again, whispering to her bunny as though it could understand. "So many people," she said softly. "All so serious." She tilted her head and looked back at her mother. "When can we go home?" Her mother gave her a faint smile, brushing hair away from her forehead. "Soon," she whispered. "Just a little longer." The girl sighed, her patience thinning. She looked toward the door, hoping someone new would come in, someone to break the monotony of the grown-up voices that droned on like background noise. She didn't know that in just a short while, the door would open, and with it, everything would change. In that moment, though, she was simply a child, pure, unfiltered, untouched by the complexities of law and justice. The innocence in her eyes contrasted sharply with the burdened faces around her. She was a reminder of something most had forgotten. Truth often hides in the simplest places, spoken not by those with years of experience, but by those who have yet to learn how to lie. Her world was made of giggles, toys, and daydreams. Yet, fate had placed her in this courtroom, on this day, at this time. And while she swung her legs and whispered to her stuffed bunny, the gears of destiny turned silently in the background. No one, neither the attorneys strategizing their next move, nor the jurors waiting to deliberate, could have imagined that. The child's unguarded voice would soon cut through the formality of the trial, like sunlight through storm clouds. She had not come to deliver justice. She had not come to testify. She had not come to sway opinions. She was only there because life had demanded her mother's presence, and her mother could not leave her behind. But children carry a strange power and unshakable honesty born from their inability to see the world as adults do. Her gaze returned to the front of the courtroom once more. She studied the officer standing tall and stoic, the emblem on his chest shining under the courtroom lights. Her lips formed questions she didn't dare ask aloud. Who were these people? Why did they all look so tired? Why couldn't anyone smile? Her innocence shielded her from the truth, that what was happening in that courtroom was bigger than her imagination, that lives were being decided, that justice was balancing on the edge of evidence and testimony. She didn't know, she couldn't know, but soon she would. For within her small frame and curious eyes lay the spark that would ignite the entire courtroom. It wasn't planned. It wasn't expected. It wasn't even understood. But it was coming. And when it did, her innocence would collide with the gravity of justice in a way that no one could ignore. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, breaking the tense silence like a crack of thunder in still air. Every head turned instinctively, eyes narrowing toward the source of the disturbance. Courtrooms had a rhythm, an unspoken flow, and any interruption, no matter how small, demanded attention. What entered was no ordinary witness, no late-arriving juror, no misplaced observer. It was a uniformed police officer, tall and imposing, with a firm hand gripping the leather leash of a German shepherd. The dog moved forward with a steady gait, its ears alert, its eyes scanning the room with practiced precision. The badge on the officer's chest glimmered under the pale lights above, but it was the animal at his side that commanded the room's energy. A murmur spread across the benches, quickly hushed by the bailiff's sharp glance. The jurors leaned forward slightly, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Dogs were not unusual in a courtroom, but they were not everyday visitors either. Their presence meant something. Their presence carried weight. And in this trial, already heavy with tension, the arrival of the canine was like a signal that something critical was about to unfold. The dog was magnificent. Its coat gleamed a mixture of tan and black, thick and well kept. Its stride was confident, but not arrogant, measured, controlled, purposeful. Every movement reflected the hours, the years of training that went into shaping it into more than a pet, more than an animal. This was an officer of the law, a partner in justice, and its very presence was meant to remind the courtroom of discipline, loyalty, and truth. The officer guided the dog toward the front, where evidence had already been presented. The prosecution had argued fiercely that the canine's role was vital in the case, that its tracking abilities and its history of service would reinforce the credibility of their argument. The defense had objected, questioning reliability, pointing to the fallibility of even the best-trained animals. The judge had ruled in favor of allowing it, though with strict instructions on what could and could not be said. And so, the dog's entrance was not merely ceremonial, it was strategic. For the jurors, though, the effect was more human than legal. They watched the dog with fascination. Some leaned forward, as if they had forgotten, for a moment, the formality of their roles. They were not looking at evidence. They were looking at a creature that radiated strength and intelligence. A few softened visibly, reminded perhaps of their own pets at home. Others stiffened, aware that the animal was here to serve a purpose beyond companionship. But for one person in the courtroom, the moment was different. At the back, the little girl's eyes widened. Her stuffed bunny, clutched tightly moments before, slipped slightly in her grasp as her entire body leaned forward in excitement. To her, this was not a piece of evidence. This was not a symbol of law. This was a dog. And dogs, in her world, were something magical. Her mother's hand pressed gently against her shoulder, a wordless reminder to stay quiet. But the child could not contain her delight. Her lips curved into a smile, her eyes sparkled, and her tiny finger pointed straight ahead. She had seen many things in the courtroom that day strange adults, serious faces, uniforms, but nothing compared to the joy of seeing an animal walk through those doors. The officer, unaware of her reaction, continued to lead the dog toward the front. The animal's ears twitched, its nose lifted slightly, as though catching a scent. It scanned the benches briefly, before returning its focus forward. To everyone else, it was a display of discipline, of training. To the little girl, it was something else entirely: recognition. The courtroom, however, was still processing the dog's arrival. The defense attorney scribbled something hurriedly on a notepad, sliding it toward his colleague. The prosecutor adjusted his stance, preparing to frame the animal's presence in a way that would strengthen his argument. The judge shifted in his chair, his sharp gaze following the officer's every step. Each person in that room understood the significance of what was unfolding. The silence deepened, broken only by the clicking of the dog's claws against the polished floor. It was a sound that echoed strangely in the vast space, like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. The jurors listened, their eyes tracking the movement, their thoughts suspended in curiosity and anticipation. For the little girl, each click was a heartbeat. She leaned closer, her small hand tugging gently at her mother's sleeve. Her voice, still contained to a whisper, carried excitement. "Mommy," she breathed, "look." Her mother nodded slightly, but kept her eyes forward, her lips pressed into a thin line of worry. She knew her daughter's joy might spill out louder than intended, and in a courtroom like this, even a whisper could tip the scales of attention. The German shepherd reached the front, sitting obediently by the officer's side. Its chest rose and fell with steady breaths, its tail still. Its presence added an invisible layer to the atmosphere, one that could not be ignored. Everyone in the room felt it. The gravity, the symbolism, the unspoken reminder that truth could be uncovered not just by human testimony, but by instincts far sharper than their own. Yet, amid the solemnity, one thing remained unnoticed: the dog's brief glance back toward the benches. Its gaze lingered for a second longer than necessary. Its ears flicked in a way that suggested familiarity, memory, perhaps even recognition. No one caught it. No one except the child. Her heart raced with a joy so pure, cut through the heavy air like sunlight through clouds. She gripped her stuffed bunny tighter, her smile growing. She didn't see the K9 as the adults did, not as evidence, not as an officer, not as part of a trial. She saw it for what it was to her. A friend, a companion, something she believed she knew. Her mother's eyes darted down, noticing her daughter's shifting posture. "Quiet, sweetheart," she whispered again, this time firmer. But the words barely registered. The child's world was no longer the courtroom. It was the German shepherd, sitting tall and proud at the front of the room, its eyes glinting in the light, its ears trained forward. It was in that moment, with innocence and excitement swelling inside her, that the child prepared to speak. She did not know the weight of her voice. She did not know the consequences of her words. She only knew what her heart told her, and at 3 years old, the heart often spoke louder than reason. The courtroom was still, waiting for the trial to resume. Papers shuffled, pens tapped, and breaths were held. No one realized that the most powerful statement of the day would not come from a witness stand, or from the mouth of an attorney, but from the small voice of a child sitting at the very back of the room. And that voice was just moments away from breaking the silence. The courtroom was still. The German shepherd sat perfectly by its handler, eyes alert, body rigid in discipline. The officer stood straight, waiting for the prosecutor's instructions, while the defense attorney shuffled papers with forced calm. It was a moment that belonged to procedure, to evidence, to the slow-turning wheels of justice. But then it happened. From the back of the courtroom, a small voice broke the silence. It was not planned, not rehearsed, not part of any strategy. It was the unfiltered voice of innocence. The little girl leaning forward on the bench, her small finger pointing at the K9, spoke clearly and without hesitation. "My puppy." The words were soft, yet they carried like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples across the entire room. For a second, no one reacted. The words hung in the air, suspended, fragile, almost too small to matter. But then the weight of them sank in, and the silence deepened, heavy and suffocating. The prosecutor froze mid-sentence, his mouth still open, as though the rest of his words had been stolen away. The defense attorney's pen stopped moving. Jurors shifted in their seats, glancing at each other with expressions of disbelief. Even the judge, who rarely allowed emotion to flicker across his stern face, leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed. The officer holding the dog stiffened, his grip tightening around the leash. His jaw clenched, betraying unease. The German shepherd, too, seemed to stir. Its ears perked, its head tilted slightly toward the child. The little girl had no idea of the storm she had unleashed. To her, the recognition was simple, natural. She saw a dog she believed she knew, a companion from her world of play and comfort, and she named it with the certainty only a child's heart could carry. My puppy, 2 words. Just 2. Yet they cut through the legal jargon, the strategies, the layers of procedure like a knife. They pierced the formality of the courtroom and reached something raw and human. Her mother gasped softly, her hand flying to cover the child's mouth, but it was too late. The words had been spoken, and the silence that followed was louder than any objection could ever be. The judge cleared his throat, his voice deeper than before. Order, he said, though the gavel remained untouched. His eyes scanned the room, finally resting on the child. His stern expression softened briefly, just enough for those watching closely to notice. The defense attorney seized the moment, leaning toward his colleague and whispering furiously. Their eyes darted to the child, then to the dog, then back to the jury. The prosecutor, caught off guard, scribbled something quickly, his face pale with the realization that the narrative had shifted. The jurors were no longer focused on evidence or testimony. Their attention was fixed on the child, her wide eyes, her innocent voice, her certainty. They were not thinking about strategy. They were thinking about truth. And the dog? The dog did not remain still. Its tail twitched, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but enough to draw attention. The officer tightened his grip again, his knuckles white. Yet the animal's eyes had locked onto the little girl. It was not just discipline breaking. It was recognition. The whispers began. Soft at first, then louder, a wave rolling through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously, realizing they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Community members leaned closer, whispering to each other about what they had heard. The bailiff called for quiet, but the damage, or perhaps the miracle, had already been done. The little girl, still pointing, repeated herself, this time with more conviction. My puppy. Her voice rang out, sweet and unshaken, as though she were simply identifying a toy she had lost and found again. Her mother's face flushed with embarrassment and fear. She pulled her daughter close, whispering frantically, No, no, sweetheart. Please, not now. Be quiet. But the child's innocence was stronger than her mother's caution. She believed what she saw, and nothing could convince her otherwise. The judge tapped his gavel once, a sharp crack that demanded silence. Order in the court, he said firmly. His gaze moved between the attorneys, the officer, and the jurors, as though weighing an invisible scale. Proceed, but how could anyone proceed after that? The prosecutor cleared his throat, trying to regain composure. Your Honor, I ask that the jury disregard, but the defense attorney interrupted sharply, his voice carrying confidence. Your Honor, the statement cannot be disregarded. It is spontaneous, unprompted, and it clearly indicates recognition. He turned deliberately toward the jury. Out of the mouths of babes, they say. This child has no agenda, no motive, no reason to lie. She simply spoke the truth as she saw it. The judge raised a hand, silencing both sides. His face remained unreadable, yet his eyes betrayed thoughtfulness. He knew the law, knew what was admissible, knew what was not. But he also knew the jury had heard it, and no instruction could erase the impact of those words. 2 words. The little girl, oblivious to the gravity of her statement, leaned back against her mother, hugging her stuffed bunny tightly. She was content now, satisfied that she had spoken the truth. Her world was simple. She had seen her puppy, and she had said so. To her, that was enough. But to the courtroom, it was everything. The air was charged, every breath drawn with caution, every movement deliberate. The jurors sat with widened eyes, their expressions no longer neutral. The defense attorney straightened his shoulders, sensing a shift in momentum. The prosecutor pressed his lips together, already recalculating strategies. The officer at the front avoided eye contact with anyone, his jaw tense. And the dog, still seated, kept glancing toward the child, its tail twitching again. It was a moment that could not be undone. The child had not spoken evidence. She had spoken innocence. Yet in that innocence lay the seed of truth that would challenge the courtroom, force questions no one had dared to ask, and open a door no legal argument had prepared for. The two words would echo long after the trial. They would be written in newspapers, whispered in coffee shops, discussed in homes. They would haunt the prosecutor, empower the defense, and unsettle the judge. But in that moment, in that very room, they did something more profound. They reminded everyone present, lawyers, jurors, officers, and spectators alike, that truth is not always complicated. Sometimes it comes from the simplest voice, at the simplest time, spoken by someone too young to know its weight. The courtroom had changed, forever. And all because a little girl pointed her finger and said, with certainty and love, "My puppy." The words still hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. My puppy. The echo had faded, but their meaning had not. Every ear had heard them. Every heart had been pierced. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was transformed into something heavy, almost suffocating, as though everyone were afraid to breathe too loudly. The judge sat motionless, his gavel resting in his hand. His usual authority, the crisp, unwavering control he commanded, seemed briefly shaken. He wasn't a man easily startled. He had presided over grisly trials, over heartbreaking cases, over men and women who had broken the law and those falsely accused. But this was different. Not because of the content of the words, but because of who had spoken them. A child, too young to scheme, too innocent to manipulate. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a faint smile he tried to suppress. He knew, perhaps more than anyone else in the room, that this moment was worth more than a dozen cross-examinations. Jurors trusted children, often more than they trusted lawyers. It wasn't evidence. It was instinct, and instinct had a way of carving its truth into the bones of a case. The prosecutor, meanwhile, sat frozen. His pen slipped from his hand, clattering softly on the table. He blinked rapidly, replaying the moment in his mind, as though sheer repetition could make it disappear. He knew it wasn't admissible. He knew the judge could instruct the jury to ignore it. But he also knew human memory didn't work that way. The image of a small girl, pointing to a police canine and calling it my pie, would stick with the jury longer than any statistic, any exhibit, any witness testimony. In the gallery, the audience buzzed like a hive disturbed. Whispers traded from one bench to the next. Did you hear that? She said it was her dog. Is it possible? The reporters' pens were alive, scratching furiously across notepads, already weaving headlines in their minds. Child identifies K9 as her own pet during trial. The story had written itself in those two words. At the front, the officer holding the leash shifted uncomfortably. His grip tightened, his knuckles whitening around the leather strap. His jaw clenched as if locking away a response. He had handled this dog for months, trained with it, worked cases with it. Yet the animal's eyes betrayed him. The German shepherd's ears twitched, its gaze fixed unflinchingly on the little girl. Its tail made the slightest thump against the polished courtroom floor, just once, then stilled under its handler's restraint. Jurors noticed. The defense noticed. Everyone noticed. The mother, cheeks flushed with fear, pulled her daughter close, whispering hurriedly, She, sweetheart, not another word. But the child leaned out of her embrace, eyes wide and pure. She wasn't scared, only curious. Why did everyone look so serious? Why was her truth causing such a stir? To her, it was simple. She had seen her puppy, and she had said so. The judge finally raised the gavel and struck it against the block. The crack echoed sharply, demanding silence. Order in the court. His voice was firm, but there was a crackle of unease beneath it. He turned to the jury. You are to disregard that statement. It was not testimony. Do not allow it to influence your deliberations. The words were law, but they were powerless. The jury members nodded as instructed, yet their eyes betrayed them. Some stole glances at the child, others at the dog. The seed had been planted, and no judicial command could uproot it. A prosecutor rose slowly, clearing his throat. Your Honor, I request that the record reflect this interruption as non-evidentiary and irrelevant to the case at hand. His voice carried authority, but not conviction. His tone cracked faintly on the last words, as though he already knew the effort was futile. The defense attorney stood immediately, pouncing on the opportunity. Your Honor, while the statement may not be official evidence, the jury cannot unhear it. What we witnessed was unprompted recognition. This court prides itself on truth, and sometimes truth comes in unexpected forms. He paused, then leaned closer, lowering his tone. Even from the mouth of a child. The gallery stirred again, murmurs swelling until the bailiff barked for silence. The judge's gavel struck twice more, sharper this time, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of thoughtfulness, perhaps even doubt. And still, through it all, the dog remained restless. It shifted on its paws, ears perked, eyes locked on the girl. For the first time since it entered the courtroom, the animal broke discipline, letting out a low whine. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the benches. The officer jerked the leash, muttering a command through clenched teeth. The dog straightened, though its eyes never wavered from the child. The little girl smiled, whispering with quiet joy, See, Mommy? He remembers me. The mother's heart ached. She pulled her daughter into her arms again, but her own eyes betrayed uncertainty now. She had heard the sound too. That wasn't the bark of a police-trained animal. That was recognition. That was longing. The room had shifted into a frozen tableau, as though time itself was unwilling to march forward. The judge sat higher in his chair, his robe draped like armor, but unable to shield him from the weight of what he had just witnessed. The attorneys stood at their tables, one buoyed by hope, the other sinking into dread. The jury, meant to remain impartial, could not hide their human hearts as they watched the child and the dog, silently writing their own conclusions. And in that silence, the enormity of the moment grew. The case was no longer just about crime and punishment. It was about identity, about belonging, about truth cutting through layers of authority. It was about a child who saw a dog and claimed it as hers, and a dog who, against all discipline, seemed to answer back. The reporters scribbled, the jurors whispered in their minds, and the people watching knew they had just seen something that would ripple far beyond those four walls. The courtroom was frozen, but the story was alive. And though the judge eventually called for a recess, though the lawyers regrouped and the bailiff escorted the witnesses out, the energy lingered. People didn't rise from their seats quickly. They whispered, exchanged glances, stole one last look at the child and the dog. Because everyone knew, whether they admitted it or not, that the trial had just shifted in a way no one could have predicted. The two words had cracked open the case. And now, nothing would ever be the same. The recess bell rang, and the courtroom emptied in tense waves. The judge's gavel had dismissed them, but the air refused to settle. Conversations buzzed through the hallways, like trapped electricity. People didn't leave quietly. They clustered in small groups, whispering and pointing, the words "my puppy" darting from mouth to mouth, as if it were the only phrase anyone could remember. The defense attorney, James Whitaker, walked with quick, measured steps, his suit jacket swinging as he pushed through the crowd. He didn't speak to reporters, though they shouted questions at him. Did the girl really identify the dog? Are you going to use that in your defense? He kept moving, but behind his sharp gaze was something that hadn't been there before: confidence. He knew momentum had shifted. Across the hall, the prosecutor, Daniel Reeves, ducked into a side chamber, his shoulders stiff. For weeks, he had built his case like a fortress, stacking witness statements, police testimony, and forensic reports, brick by brick. And in one innocent moment, a child had sent a crack running straight through it. But the most unsettled of all was Officer Grant, the canine's handler. He walked stiffly, one hand gripping the leash tighter than ever, his eyes darting as though someone might corner him with questions. The German shepherd padded calmly at his side, but every now and then, its head turned back toward the doors of the courtroom, ears twitching, as though waiting for the little girl to return. "Control your dog," a bailiff muttered under his breath as the officer passed. Grant gave a curt nod, but said nothing. His jaw was clenched so tightly, it looked like it might crack. Inside the judge's chambers, silence reigned. Judge Morrison leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't easily rattled, but he couldn't ignore what had happened. He rubbed his temples slowly, knowing that in the eyes of the public, 2 words from a child might outweigh months of testimony. He had to keep control of the trial, yet even he couldn't pretend he hadn't seen the dog's reaction. When the trial resumed later that afternoon, the tension was different. It was no longer just the defense against the prosecution. It was truth against doubt, innocence against authority, and no one knew which side would prevail. The prosecutor began by calling a witness, a neighbor who had testified to hearing barking from the defendant's property on the night in question. It should have been a strong reinforcement of the narrative, but as the neighbor spoke, jurors glanced toward the dog. They remembered the way it had perked up at the child's words, the low whine that had followed. The testimony fell flat, like a song sung off-key. The defense seized the opportunity during cross-examination. "Sir," Whitaker said smoothly, pacing before the jury, "you testified you heard barking. But dogs bark all over this town, do they not?" "Yes," the neighbor admitted reluctantly. "And you cannot say with certainty that the barking you heard belonged to this very dog, can you?" The witness fidgeted. "No, I guess not." Whitaker leaned closer, lowering his voice, as though letting the jury in on a secret. "In fact, would you agree that if this animal were once someone's pet, its behavior might not always align with what you'd expect from a strictly trained canine?" "Objection," the prosecutor barked. "Speculation." "Sustained," the judge said, though his tone lacked its usual force. He was cautious now, careful not to appear swayed, but everyone could see the case wasn't as airtight as before. The defense attorney smiled faintly, as though he had accomplished exactly what he wanted, planting doubt. Outside the courthouse, the story had already exploded. Reporters stood on the courthouse steps, microphones raised, delivering live broadcasts. A shocking turn in the trial today, as a 3-year-old girl claimed the police dog was her missing pet. Cameras flashed, and the public devoured every word. Social media flooded with hashtags. Hashtag my puppy, hashtag courtroom dog, hashtag truth from innocence. By evening, pictures of the girl pointing at the canine were splashed across news sites. Comment sections swelled with debates. Some said it was a coincidence, a child's imagination. Others believed it was the crack that would expose corruption. And quietly, behind the noise, whispers grew darker. Was the police hiding something? Meanwhile, Officer Grant sat in his patrol car long after his shift had ended, the dog lying quietly in the back seat. He stared at the steering wheel, sweat gathering at his temples, despite the cool night. His mind replayed the child's voice. My puppy. He knew. Deep down, he knew. The dog stirred, its nose pressed to the glass, as though searching for something or someone. Grant closed his eyes, whispering to himself. Not now. Not like this. But guilt gnawed at him. Secrets he had buried beneath obedience, and orders clawed their way to the surface. The next day in court, the defense motioned for discovery of the dog's origins. They argued that if the K-9 had been reassigned, adopted, or claimed in questionable circumstances, the jury deserved to know. The prosecutor objected fiercely, calling it irrelevant, but the judge, after a long pause, agreed to allow limited questioning. It was a small victory for the defense, but a seismic shift in the trial's course. Suddenly, the case wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about the dog itself. When Officer Grant was called to the stand, the room leaned forward as one. He testified with crisp professionalism at first, reciting training routines, dates of deployment, the dog's role in investigations. But Whitaker pressed harder. Officer, where did you first acquire this animal? Grant hesitated. From the department's K-9 unit. And before that? What was the dog's history? Objection. The prosecutor shouted. Irrelevant. Overruled, Judge Morrison said firmly, surprising even himself. Answer the question. Grant's throat bobbed as he swallowed. It was transferred. A shelter dog, reassigned. A murmur rippled through the room. Whitaker pounced. A shelter dog? So it is possible, is it not, that this dog once belonged to a family? A child? Perhaps even the very child who identified it yesterday? Grant's hands gripped the railing of the witness stand, his knuckles pale. His jaw worked silently for a moment before he forced out, It's possible. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, the shuffling of papers. The judge's gavel slammed repeatedly, demanding order. But the damage had been done. The jurors' faces told the story: shock, suspicion, curiosity. The defense attorney had not proven ownership, but he had cracked the door wide open. And in that crack, truth was beginning to seep through. As recess was called again, the little girl clung to her mother, peering toward the dog. The German shepherd, despite its handler's commands, stood halfway up, ears forward, tail swishing once, twice. The bond was undeniable. For the first time since the trial began, the defense attorney allowed himself to hope aloud. This isn't just about a crime anymore. This is about something much bigger. The turning point had arrived, and the storm was only beginning. The courthouse felt different the next morning. The usual hum of anticipation was sharpened, edged with something heavier expectation. By now, the world beyond the courtroom had its eyes locked on the trial. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, their cameras angled high, their microphones thrust forward at anyone who dared step near the front doors. Inside, the seats were filled long before the gavel struck. The air buzzed, the jurors leaned in, and the defendant sat straighter than ever before, a flicker of hope etched across his face. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom anymore. The case had transformed into something larger. Justice had tilted in an unexpected direction. And at the center of it all, sitting quietly in the gallery, was the little girl. Her legs swung above the floor, her tiny hands clutching the edge of her mother's skirt. She wasn't aware of the storm she had created. To her, it was simple. She had seen her puppy. And somehow, she believed the world now understood. The bailiff's voice rang out. All rise. Judge Morrison entered, his expression grave. He had spent the night in restless thought. The law was supposed to be clean, structured, and firm. But truth was messy, and yesterday it had walked into his courtroom on 4 legs and wagged its tail at a little girl. "Court is in session," he announced, his voice steady. Yet his eyes lingered briefly on the canine at Officer Grant's side. The dog sat obediently, but its ears twitched every time the girl shifted in her seat. The defense attorney, James Whitaker, rose immediately. "Your Honor, the defense respectfully requests permission to call an expert witness this morning. A veterinarian specializing in canine identification and behavioral recognition." The prosecutor, Daniel Reeves, leapt to his feet. "Objection. This is a murder trial, not a custody dispute over a dog. This is irrelevant to the charges at hand." Whitaker turned to the jury, his voice sharpened with conviction. "Irrelevant? Ladies and gentlemen, if this dog's identity is tied to my client, then it proves a far greater issue, that evidence has been mishandled. That trust has been broken. That what we are seeing is not justice, but manipulation." The jury shifted, visibly intrigued. The judge exhaled slowly. "Objection overruled. You may proceed." A murmur rippled through the crowd as a middle-aged veterinarian took the stand. She carried herself with quiet authority, her white coat crisp, her demeanor calm. Whitaker wasted no time. "Doctor, is it possible to determine whether a police canine once belonged to a private family?" "Yes," she replied, nodding. "Dogs, like people, carry histories. Medical records, microchips, unique markings, even behavioral responses to familiar cues can reveal past ownership." The defense attorney's voice sharpened. "And if such evidence existed, could it be verified here, in this courtroom?" The vet's gaze swept the jury. "Absolutely." The room seemed to tighten with anticipation. Even the dog, as if sensing the shift, tilted its head. The prosecutor tried to cut in. "This is theatrics. This dog is registered as a K9 unit. End of story." But the vet spoke again, steady and certain. "With respect, sir, dogs don't lie." Gasps scattered through the gallery. Whitaker nodded. "Your Honor, with permission, I'd like to examine the dog." The judge hesitated. His gavel hovered above the block, but finally he lowered it. "Proceed." Officer Grant's jaw tightened. He led the German shepherd to the stand, every step reluctant. The dog's nails clicked against the wooden floor. When it reached the stand, it turned not to the vet, not to the handler, but to the little girl in the gallery. Its ears perked, its tail wagged faintly. The jurors leaned forward as one. The vet crouched, her movements calm and deliberate. She ran practiced hands along the dog's fur, checking its ears, scanning its body. Then she paused, parting the fur along the neck. A faint scar, barely visible, curved under the collar. She looked up. "Does this child's family have veterinary records for a dog?" The mother clutched her purse, fumbling for papers she hadn't dared bring until now. With trembling hands, she produced them. The vet examined them carefully, then looked to the jury. "It matches. Same scar, same age, same build. This dog belonged to the child's family." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, shouts. It was chaos. Reporters scribbled furiously. People stood from their seats, and the judge slammed his gavel over and over. "Order! Order!" But the truth was out. The little girl beamed, clapping her tiny hands. "See, Mommy? I told you. He's my puppy." The German shepherd whined softly, wagging its tail in response. The bond was undeniable. The prosecutor's face drained of color. He stood, sputtering. "This proves nothing about the crime itself. It is irrelevant to the charges." But Whitaker's voice cut sharp. "Irrelevant? Or inconvenient? This dog, once this child's pet, is now being paraded as the state's star witness. How did it end up here? Who authorized it? Who benefited from taking a child's dog and turning it into evidence? The jurors' faces hardened. Suspicion shifted not toward the defendant, but toward the system itself. The judge's face was unreadable, yet his eyes betrayed thought. He turned toward Officer Grant. "Officer, can you confirm this dog's acquisition records?" Grant's mouth opened, then closed. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. His hands shook against the railing. Finally, his voice cracked. "They told me not to ask questions, just to take the dog and train it." The courtroom froze. "Who told you?" Whitaker pressed. Grant's lips trembled. His gaze dropped to the floor. "The department. The order came from higher up. I didn't know it belonged to a family. I swear." The gallery gasped again. The defense attorney's eyes gleamed. The prosecution's fortress had not only cracked, it was crumbling. The judge leaned forward, voice low and heavy. "Mr. Reeves, do you wish to address this?" The prosecutor stammered, but no words came. His silence screamed louder than denial. The jurors exchanged looks. They weren't just jurors anymore. They were witnesses to a revelation. For the first time, the balance of justice had shifted visibly, irreversibly. The little girl leaned her cheek against her mother's arm, her smile innocent and sure. She didn't understand court politics or corruption or the weight of truth. All she knew was that her puppy had found her again. And in that simple truth, an entire case began to collapse. The courtroom felt like it was vibrating. Every seat was filled, every reporter poised, every juror tense. Overnight, the trial had exploded into national headlines. Child identifies police canine as missing pet. Courtroom shaken by innocent testimony. Social media blazed with hashtags, videos, and commentary. The world was watching. But inside those four walls, the drama was no longer spectacle. It was truth. Judge Morrison entered, robe swaying heavily as if carrying the weight of justice itself. His face was carved with lines of thought, his gavel tapping once. Court is now in session. His eyes swept the room, pausing on the defendant, then the prosecution, then the little girl in the gallery. He cleared his throat. "Proceed." The prosecutor, Daniel Reeves, rose first. His face was pale, his words stiff. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you must not be swayed by emotion. This case is about murder, not a pet. Do not lose sight of what is at stake." His voice cracked. He was fighting shadows, and he knew it. The jury's faces were cold, their eyes skeptical. Emotion wasn't something they could forget. It was the very thing that defined their humanity. The defense attorney, James Whitaker, stood next. His presence commanded silence. He walked slowly, deliberately, his gaze locked on the jurors. "Emotion?" he asked softly. "Is truth not emotional? When a child points at a dog and says, 'My puppy,' is that not the rawest form of truth we've ever seen in this courtroom?" He turned, gesturing toward the animal. The German shepherd sat tall, ears pricked, tail thumping faintly against the floor as it stared at the girl. This is not about theatrics. This is about trust. The state paraded this dog as a loyal servant of justice. Yet we now know it was taken from a family, stripped of its past, and turned into a tool. If they can do this to a child, what else have they twisted? He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. This case has been built on broken trust. And when trust breaks, so does the foundation of justice. The jury leaned forward, hanging on every syllable. Whitaker's voice rose, filled with conviction. You are not just deciding one man's fate. You are deciding whether justice can survive corruption, whether truth can be silenced, whether innocence still matters in a courtroom like this. He stepped back, his final words sharp as a blade. The little girl spoke 2 words. 2 words that carried more truth than all the state's testimony combined. Do not ignore her. Do not ignore what you saw with your own eyes. Find my client not guilty. Silence fell heavy. The jury retired to deliberate. Hours passed, but to those waiting, it felt like days. The mother held her daughter close. The little girl hummed quietly, clutching her stuffed bunny, unaware of how her tiny voice had shifted the course of lives. The dog, resting at the officer's feet, occasionally raised its head, eyes fixed on her with a devotion that words couldn't capture. When the jury returned, the room went still. The foreman stood, paper in hand, voice trembling slightly. We, the jury, find the defendant. A pause that stretched like an eternity. Not guilty. Gasps filled the air. The mother broke into tears, clutching her daughter tightly. The defendant closed his eyes, relief flooding his face as if a boulder had been lifted from his chest. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed, and whispers became cheers in the hallway outside. The judge nodded solemnly. The court thanks the jury for its service. This trial is concluded. His gavel struck once, sharp and final. But the story wasn't over. As the courtroom emptied, Officer Grant knelt beside the dog. His face was lined with shame, but his voice was soft. "Go on," he whispered, loosening the leash. The dog bolted not to the exit, not to the handler, but straight to the little girl. The child squealed with delight, dropping her bunny as she wrapped her arms around the dog's neck. The German shepherd nuzzled her face, tail wagging furiously, a sound of soft whine spilling from its throat. It wasn't the controlled canine sound of command and obedience. It was joy, recognition, home. Tears streamed down her mother's face as she stroked the dog's fur. He's back. After all this time, he's really back. The gallery erupted into applause, jurors smiling through tears, reporters capturing every second. The image of the little girl hugging her dog would grace newspapers and screens for weeks to come. But for the family, it was more than a story. It was a miracle. Officer Grant stood silently, watching. He had followed orders, but now the weight of them crushed him. He approached the mother, voice heavy with guilt. "I didn't know," he whispered. "They told me it was just a transfer. I'm sorry." The mother looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "You trained him well." But he was never theirs to keep. The officer lowered his head, the truth of her words burning in his chest. In the days that followed, investigations opened. The department's shady handling of evidence and K-9 assignments came under fire. Higher-ups were suspended. Questions were asked that had no easy answers. But change had been set in motion. For the family, though, life had shifted in a quieter, more profound way. The little girl no longer asked about her missing puppy at bedtime, because now he slept at the foot of her bed, his steady breathing a comfort that words couldn't replace. Sometimes, at night, her mother would watch her daughter and the dog curled up together, and she would remember the courtroom. She would remember the gasps, the chaos, the gavel, the flood of relief. And she would think of 2 words, so small, yet so powerful, that it changed everything. My puppy? Those words had toppled walls, cracked open corruption, freed an innocent man, and reunited a family with their lost companion. The story spread across the country, a reminder that truth didn't always roar in thunderous speeches. Sometimes it whispered in the smallest of voices. Sometimes it wagged its tail. And sometimes it came from the lips of a child who refused to be ignored.